I want to return to this knowledge as substance idea, and I think this is the last thing I have to say on this for now. But just to recap where I am in my own thinking with that so far. Firstly, the term knowledge is a relational term. It specifies the kind of possession of an item of knowledge by an individual. Knowledge implicitly indicates a knower, and so forms part of a relationship between a subject and a notional object of that knowledge. Something like a fact or a piece of data or a piece of information, something like that. So the term knowledge, I think, is best understood as indicating that relationship, or it lies quite close to a determination of that relationship. If instead of thinking about knowledge you think about data or information, I don't think that destroys the presence of that relationship. It just makes it a little bit more covert, because I think the way that we understand data and information and other terms like that is, conceptually at least, is as participants within the same subject-object relationship. As I say, we just don't draw it. It just doesn't draw attention to the presence of a subjective knower in that relationship. But I think it absolutely implies it. And the reason why I think that implies it, as I was saying in my last video, is because our understandings of those kind of metaphorical objects of knowledge take their logic from the schematic understandings we have of our completely concrete and physical understanding of objects in lived experience, and that kind of maps onto this cognitive process by which we can conceive of objects of knowledge. And so all acts of knowing, whether we know information or whether we know data or whether we know facts, as I said, they partake of that same metaphorical schema, it seems to me. Okay, so where am I going with that? Oh yeah, I suppose I'm just saying that according to that logic, I'm not saying that information or data or you know the existence of the universe is called into question. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that the means by which we understand it is based on the mechanisms of our understanding. And the mechanisms of our understanding use these things like metaphors or image schema or these kind of maps. And the way we understand knowledge, I think, primarily is in this kind of object relationship, which inevitably produces the illusion that there is such a thing as objective knowledge outside of human cognition. Or if I can just rephrase that, it gives us a particular understanding of what kinds of knowledge pre-exist or transcend human knowing. It doesn't answer the question of whether knowledge, in some kind of abstract sense, does exist outside of human knowing. It just frames that question in a very particular way and organises it in a set of relationships. But what I want to come on to today is this last thing to do with substance itself, which I think is a really important one. It's the bit that I'm most interested in myself right now. And it's to do with the configurations of these imaginary objects of knowledge. Because when we talk about knowledge or information or data or those kind of things, we use a set of substance metaphors to talk about what kind of knowledge that is. And so we do use terms like hard knowledge or knowledge being the results of a hard science. And we talk occasionally about the soft sciences, with the implication being that the kind of knowledge that emerges from those processes is similarly soft. We talk about some facts, some data that emerges from particular kinds of hard science processes as being robust data. So it starts to acquire this quality of a hard object, or we talk about it as if it was a hard object. And not just a hard object, but one that's clearly bounded, that has a very, very well-defined outline to it, one that persists over time. We seem to feel that some objects of knowledge have a permanence to them, whilst other objects of knowledge are perhaps temporary. and perhaps more malleable. So we're starting to see some kind of variations in the substantial, the imaginary, metaphorical, substantial quality of different objects of knowledge. So these imaginary objects placed at some remove from us in this kind of subject-object relationship start to function differently and can be used for different purposes. The objects of hard knowledge we feel quite happy about. This might sound a bit ridiculous, but we seem to feel quite happy about using those as building materials. So when Thomas Kuhn is talking about edifice of knowledge, he's alluding to a metaphor of building and architecture, as if you're kind of constructing some cathedral. And of course, if you're going to construct something, you need hard materials which are hard and permanent and resilient and robust to be able to do that. So you can only really build an edifice if you're using hard knowledge, the objects of which appears to have these kind of hard qualities. You can't do that with softer materials. You can't. I guess part of not exactly the problems, but part of the confusions and the complexities that you find in knowledge buildings in the social sciences is because it doesn't have that kind of edifice status. Quite a lot of the time, in some of the social sciences at least, the kind of constructions that are made, the kind of interpretive strategies that are produced by the processes of the social sciences feel very kind of flimsy and frail and partial and perhaps temporary, and can be laid aside, and some other structure can be put together quite quickly. They feel much more kind of poetic in a sense. And as I say, temporary and contingent and only applicable in certain circumstances. They have that kind of quality to them a lot of the time. And I think something like religious knowledge. When I was a kid, I used to do religious knowledge at school. It was a required subject at school. RK. We used to do RK once a week. And I'm not sure what the status of that knowledge is. I mean, in a sense, you build an edifice, but it was a kind of just an edifice of history. And an edifice made of a series of facts about who wrote what. It's not really an edifice to do with religion and kind of what you might call spirituality. I don't think you could build an edifice from spiritual materials. Almost by definition, the meanings is right there on the surface, I think, and that spiritual materials are evanescent and they float apart, and they have. And spiritual knowledge, if you like, is not hard knowledge. It's much more vaporous and weightless and ill-formed and badly bounded. So clearly you couldn't build anything out of spiritual materials. There's other things you might be able to do with it. You might feel those spiritual materials infusing you, or you might feel those objects of spiritual knowledge forming kind of pools that you might immerse yourself in. You might feel illuminated by those spiritual materials. They might energize you. All other kinds of relationships can be got into with objects of knowing which are not firm. But what you can't do with those, I think, is build edifices, build robust structures, which I think is one of the problems with a lot of the kind of creation science end of religious knowledge. You're trying to build a robust edifice out of materials which aren't up to the task. You're building on sand, or you're building with you're trying to plat piss, is one of my favourite expressions. But you're trying to do something which the materials will not support, and you're not using the materials in the way that they're best used, actually, at all either. Okay, so that's the only thing about knowledge, that to the extent that knowledge functions as objects in our conception, the status of those objects, the kinds of substances we imaginatively construct them out of, or imagine them to be made of, has a bearing on what you can do with those objects of knowledge, and what's impossible to do with them. Okay.